On a bone-chilling winter night, a solitary man noticed two wolves silently prowling the edge of his property. But these majestic yet fearsome creatures weren't baring their fangs or growling. Instead, they seemed desperate, their eyes pleading as they stared at his door as if begging for shelter. When he finally opened that door, he had no idea the life-changing moment that awaited him. What did these frozen wolves want? And why would they seek the warmth of a human's home over the wild they called home? Warren Pierce was no stranger to brutal winters. Having spent his entire life in the remote Alaskan wilderness, he was well versed in sub-zero temperatures and relentless winds. His sturdy log cabin, weathered by time, stood as a testament to his resilience in one of the planet's harshest environments. Yet, despite his rugged experience, nothing could have prepared him for what he witnessed one snowy evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as it gets in the dead of winter. Warren had chopped enough firewood to last the night and checked on his small vegetable greenhouse, kept alive by a single heater. As dusk settled, he retreated indoors, ready to spend the long dark hours by the crackling fireplace with a steaming mug of tea. But then, a strange scratching at his front door broke the silence, accompanied by soft whines. At first, Warren assumed it was a stray dog, perhaps one of the feral canines that roamed the outskirts of town. But when he peered out the frosted window, his heart began to race. There, on his porch, stood two emaciated wolves. Their once proud coats were matted and dusted with snow, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Instead of snarling or acting aggressively, they trembled with cold and exhaustion. One of them even let out a weak howl, as if calling for help. Warren's instincts warred with caution. Wolves were, after all, wild predators. But these animals didn't seem menacing. They seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, Warren grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open the door. The closer wolf took a shaky step forward, its glowing eyes filled not with hostility, but with a pleading intensity. In that moment, any fear he felt was overshadowed by a surge of compassion. What had driven these creatures to seek refuge from a human? And if he let them in, would his act of kindness invite danger into his home? Thus began an extraordinary encounter between a solitary man and two wild wolves. An encounter that would test Warren's resolve, challenge his preconceptions of nature, and lead to an outcome no one could have predicted. Warren stood at the threshold of his cabin, his heart pounding as he took in the sight of the two wolves. Snow swirled around them, collecting in small drifts by his front door. The temperature had plummeted well below zero, and he could see the animals shivering beneath their fur. Their wide, luminous eyes seemed to plead for warmth and safety, a sight both mesmerizing and unsettling. Wild predators begging for sanctuary. Still clutching the doorknob, Warren hesitated. Common sense told him that inviting wolves into his home was a terrible idea. They were wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Yet, the longer he stared into their haunted expressions, the more convinced he became that they posed no immediate threat. Their trembling bodies and weary demeanor spoke of desperation, not aggression. With a deep breath, he made a decision. Wincing against the biting wind, he opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. The wolves exchanged a glance, if it could even be called that, before cautiously padding forward, their paws leaving faint imprints in the blowing snow. The moment their fur made contact with the cabin, shudder seemed to pass through them, as if they were finally releasing the tension they'd carried for miles in the cold. Gracefully, the pair stepped across the threshold and stopped just inside the living area. Warren, moving slowly to avoid startling them, closed the door, sealing out the howling wind. He offered a silent prayer that his instincts weren't wrong. The wolves stood still for a moment, their breaths loud in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Then they began exploring with careful curiosity, noses to the ground, sniffing at the furniture and the small pile of firewood near the hearth. Warren stood close by, silently observing. One wolf, slightly smaller, with a patch of gray fur across its back, limped slightly, favoring its hind leg. Its rib cage was visible beneath its coat, a clear sign of prolonged hunger. The other wolf, slightly larger, had a scar running along its muzzle. Despite their emaciated state, they held a quiet dignity, moving without haste or panic. Warren couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe at their raw beauty. He approached the fireplace, tossing in another log to bolster the heat. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, filling the cabin with a warm glow. The wolves turned their attention to the fire, one of them letting out a soft whine as it drew closer. Perhaps it was the first time they'd ever been near such a source of warmth. As the room grew cozier, Warren realized he needed to address the obvious next step: food. He rummaged through his modest pantry, pulling out some meat he'd planned to cook for himself. He wondered if feeding wolves raw cuts was wise, but given their condition, he didn't see much choice. Returning to the living area, he placed a plate of meat on the floor and stepped back. The smaller wolf approached first, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. The larger wolf joined in, and together they devoured the meal within seconds, their eyes reflecting gratitude and relief. Warren felt a pang of sympathy. How long had it been since they'd eaten? The wild was brutal, and the bitter cold made hunting nearly impossible for weak or injured animals. Once fed, the wolves seemed to relax further, their tense posture softening. Warren, still keeping a respectful distance, settled into a chair near the fireplace. He was keenly aware of the risk he was taking, but something about their demeanor reassured him. They were exhausted, possibly near death's door, and had reached a point where pride and caution gave way to survival instinct. The fact that they allowed him in such close proximity spoke volumes about their desperation and their trust. The hours passed in an odd sort of companionship. Warren tended to fire, flipping through an old novel he'd read countless times, while the wolves dozed fitfully, occasionally lifting their heads at a gust of wind outside or the faint crackle of the hearth. At one point, the larger wolf whimpered softly in its sleep, its paws twitching as though running in a dream. Warren felt an unexpected urge to soothe it, but he refrained, respecting the boundary between them. As night wore on, Warren prepared a makeshift bedding area near the warmest corner of the cabin. He coaxed the wolves there, offering blankets and extra logs on the fire. They accepted, though somewhat wearily, curling up with their noses tucked under their tails. Watching them, Warren realized he should probably get some rest himself. The day had been anything but ordinary, and fatigue weighed on him. Before turning in, he double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, an old habit in bear country. Now it seemed doubly important, given that he had two wolves inside. As he dimmed the lights, he found himself silently praying for a peaceful night, free of conflict. He couldn't help but recall stories of wolf attacks, yet his gut told him these creatures were not here to harm him. The first stirrings of dawn arrived sooner than expected. Warren awoke to the gentle glow of sunrise filtering through the frosted windows. He checked the living area, half expecting chaos or some sign of aggression, but instead he found a quiet scene. The wolves were awake yet calm, watching him with expressions that he could only describe as weary gratitude. He stoked the fire, noticing that the smaller wolf's limp seemed worse this morning. Perhaps it had strained itself further during the night. Concerned, Warren decided to see if it would allow him closer. Moving slowly, he knelt and extended his hand. The wolf eyed him, but remained still, as though sensing he meant no harm. Gently, Warren placed his hand on the wolf's hind leg. It flinched, emitting a soft growl of pain, but didn't snap. He detected swelling, maybe an old injury or frostbite. Medical treatment would be risky, but he couldn't stand idly by. "I'll do what I can," he murmured, as if the wolf could understand. Standing, he gathered a basic first aid kit from his cupboard, mentally thanking his years in the Boy Scouts. He had no veterinary experience, but he could at least clean and bandage the wound. The real challenge would be whether the wolf trusted him enough to permit it. Watching from a corner, the larger wolf tensed, its amber eyes fixed on Warren's every move. Sensing the delicate balance of trust, Warren proceeded with the utmost caution. He knelt beside the smaller wolf, who lay trembling on the blankets, and murmured soothing words. If the wolf allowed this, he might just be able to help. If not, he'd have to back off. One wrong move could trigger the primal instinct still lurking beneath their fragile truce. The smaller wolf stared at Warren with a mix of apprehension and pain, its body quivering as if unsure whether to trust this human crouched before it. Warren gently patted the blankets, hoping to coax the wolf into lying still. To his relief, it let out a low whine and rested its head on its paws. The larger wolf remained close by, watching the scene intently, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of threat. Warren opened his rudimentary first aid kit, a mismatched collection of bandages, antiseptics, and gauze. He hadn't used it much in the past, aside from treating the occasional scratch or blister from chopping wood. This was a different scenario entirely. He moved slowly, speaking in soft tones, aware that the smaller wolf could lash out if spooked. "Easy, fella," he murmured, placing a folded towel beneath the wolf's injured hind leg. As he dabbed antiseptic on a cotton swab, the wolf let out a faint growl, but didn't pull away. The wound wasn't deep, but it was inflamed, possibly from an earlier injury that had been aggravated by the cold and constant movement. Warren's heart clenched at the thought of how much suffering this creature had likely endured in the wild winter landscape. The larger wolf paced a few feet away, letting out a low rumble of concern. Warren glanced at it, offering a quick nod in acknowledgement. "I'm doing my best," he said, as though the wolf could truly understand. He knew it was a risk to speak aloud and draw attention to himself, but he hoped his calm tone would keep the tension at bay. After cleaning the wound and applying a light bandage, Warren carefully examined the wolf's paw pads, noticing cracks and signs of frostbite. He used a mild ointment to soothe the raw skin before gently wrapping the leg with gauze. Throughout the process, the wolf flinched and whimpered, but remained surprisingly cooperative. Once he finished, Warren exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Done," he whispered, slowly removing his hands. The wolf exhaled through its nose, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Warren offered a small smile, a surge of empathy welling up inside him. With the immediate medical needs addressed, Warren turned his attention to the basic matter of survival. He checked his pantry to see what remained of the food he'd given the wolves earlier. He still had enough supplies to feed them again, but his stock was limited. The realization weighed on him. If these wolves intended to stay longer than a day or two, he'd need a plan to secure more resources, something that wasn't easy during the harsh Alaskan winter. He decided to head out briefly to gather more firewood and check on potential hunting opportunities nearby. Grabbing his coat and gloves, Warren paused at the door, glancing back at the wolves. They watched him, but made no move to follow. "I'll be back soon," he said softly, as if reassuring both them and himself. Stepping outside, Warren was greeted by a stark landscape of white. The sky remained overcast, and the wind cut through his layers of clothing. He trudged through knee-high snow to the woodpile near the edge of his property, filling a sled with logs. Every so often, he scanned the horizon, half expecting to see more wolves or any sign of threatening wildlife. His mind raced with questions. Had these two been part of a larger pack? Were they outcasts? And what would happen if their pack came looking? Once the sled was loaded, Warren took a moment to survey the silent wilderness. The land was beautiful, but it also felt eerily unforgiving. He caught himself imagining the smaller wolf limping through these drifts, hungry and wounded, pushed to the brink of desperation. The thought reaffirmed his decision to help. No creature should have to endure such suffering alone. Upon returning to the cabin, Warren found the wolves lying near the fireplace. The smaller one looked to be in better spirits, occasionally licking at its bandaged leg. The larger wolf, ever vigilant, lifted its head to watch him cross the threshold. Warren unloaded the wood by the fireplace and stoked the flames, sighing in relief as the heat spread across his numb fingers. He unwrapped a portion of his remaining meat supply, placing it on a plate and setting it on the floor. The wolves approached cautiously, grateful for the meal, but aware of Warren's presence. As they ate, he considered how surreal the situation was. Two wild wolves devouring his provisions within the comfort of his living room. Yet he felt no fear, only a growing bond forged through mutual survival. Hours later, the cabin had fallen into a peaceful rhythm. Warren dozed in his armchair by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The wolves rested on the blankets he'd arranged for them, rising only to lap water from a bowl he'd placed nearby. It occurred to him that he should contact someone, perhaps a local ranger or wildlife specialist. But a part of him worried that doing so might lead to the wolves being taken away or worse, put down if deemed a threat. Conflicted, he resolved to wait another day to see if they'd regain their strength and perhaps wander back into the wild on their own. He felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of wanting to keep them around longer. Their presence, though unusual, gave him a sense of purpose. Night fell again, and the wind howled outside. Inside the cabin, The glow of the hearth remained a steadfast beacon against the darkness. Warren, restless from the day's events, found himself pacing. The wolves watched him, their gaze quiet and understanding. It was as if they recognized his turmoil. Eventually, he sank into the chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. What would the morning bring? Would the wolves depart, returning to the life nature intended for them? Or would they linger, forging an even deeper connection to this human who had opened his heart and home? Warren couldn't be sure. All he knew was that the next few days would test his compassion, his resourcefulness, and possibly his limits. Dawn broke with a fragile light, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered landscape. Inside Warren's cabin, the warmth of a hearth enveloped him and his two unexpected guests. As he stirred from sleep, Warren noticed something peculiar. The larger wolf was no longer lying by the fire. A slight sense of alarm washed over him. Had it slipped out into the night? Could it have ventured back into the freezing wilderness? His concern was quickly answered by a low growl emanating from the far corner of the living room. There, standing protectively over the smaller injured wolf, was the larger one. Its ears were flattened, hackles raised, but it wasn't looking at Warren. Instead, its gaze was fixed on the door. Warren's heart lurched. What had startled the wolf? Rising cautiously, he moved toward the window. Outside, in the morning's half-light, he caught sight of movement. Something was skulking just beyond the edge of his property, near the tree line. His breath fogged the cold glass as he peered out more intently. At first, he thought it might be another animal, a moose or a bear. But then, a human silhouette emerged from behind a thick pine. Adrenaline coursed through Warren. He didn't often have visitors, especially not during the harshest part of winter. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight, he pressed an ear to the door, listening for any sound. The larger wolf continued to growl, as though reinforcing the warning that someone was out there. The smaller wolf struggled to rise, whining softly. "It's all right," Warren whispered, hoping to soothe them both and himself. He opened the door just a crack, a blast of cold air rushing in. Outside, the figure had vanished from immediate view, but footprints in the snow led around the side of the cabin. The shelter was warm, the fire crackling softly in the background, casting a golden glow over the room. The three wolves lay together on the blankets, their bodies close, their breaths steady. The smaller wolf, her bandaged legs stretched out, rested her head on the larger wolf's shoulder, her eyes half closed in contentment. The third wolf, the one I'd found in the woods, lay curled up beside them, his body still thin but no longer trembling. He nuzzled the smaller wolf gently, his movements slow and deliberate, as if reassuring her that everything was going to be okay. The larger wolf watched over them both, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight, his posture protective but relaxed. It was a moment of quiet peace, a stark contrast to the chaos and tension of the past few days. I stood near the door, watching them, a lump forming in my throat. They were no longer just wild animals. They were a family, bound together by something deeper than survival. They had found each other again, and in doing so, they had found a kind of strength that I could only admire. Kara stood beside me, her arms crossed, a small smile playing on her lips. "They're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "They've got each other now." I nodded, unable to speak. The sight of them together, safe and warm, was almost too much to bear. I thought about the first night they had come to my cabin, desperate and afraid, and how far they had come since then. They had trusted me against all odds, and I had done everything I could to help them. But now, as I watched them nuzzle each other, their tails wagging faintly, I realized that they had helped me just as much as I had helped them. They had reminded me what it meant to care, to fight for something, to believe in the possibility of second chances. The larger wolf looked up at me, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment it felt like he was saying, "Thank you." I knelt down, my hand reaching out to stroke his fur. He didn't flinch or growl, he just leaned into my touch, his body warm and solid beneath my fingers. The smaller wolf let out a soft whine, her tail thumping against the blanket, and the third wolf lifted his head, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. In that moment, I felt a connection, a bond that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. They were no longer just wolves. They were my family, my pack. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wild beast, the snow piling up against the walls of the shelter, the tarps strained against the force of the gale, their edges flapping violently, threatening to tear free. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the fire flickering weakly as the cold seeped in through every crack and crevice. The wolves huddled together near the flames, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The smaller wolf, her bandaged legs stretched out, whimpered softly, her eyes wide with fear. The larger wolf stood over her, his body tense, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. He let out a low growl, not at me, but at the storm, as if daring it to try and take what was his. The third wolf, the one I'd found in the woods, lay curled up beside them, his body trembling slightly, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. I stoked the fire, adding more wood to the flames, my hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The storm had been raging for hours, and there was no sign of it letting up. The wind howled louder, the snow piling higher, and I could feel the walls of the shelter groaning under the pressure. I glanced at the wolves, their eyes meeting mine, and I saw the same fear and determination reflected in their gaze. We were in this together, fighting against the same enemy, the relentless, unforgiving force of nature. Kara sat nearby, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale but resolute. "We'll make it through this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The storm was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a monstrous living thing that seemed determined to tear us apart. But as I looked at the wolves, their bodies pressed together, their breaths steady despite the chaos around them, I felt a surge of determination. We had come too far to give up now. The larger wolf let out a sharp bark, his ears twitching as the wind howled louder. The smaller wolf whimpered again, her tail curling around her body, and the third wolf lifted his head, his eyes locking with mine. In that moment, I felt a connection, a bond that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. We were survivors, all of us, fighting against the same odds, and as long as we had each other, we had a chance. I added another log to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting a warm glow over the shelter. The storm raged on, but inside we held on to each other, our breaths steady, our hearts beating in unison. We were a pack, united by something deeper than survival. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. The truck idled outside the cabin, its headlights cutting through the snowy twilight, casting long shadows across the snow. The wolves were loaded into crates, their eyes reflecting the light, their breaths visible in the cold air. Warren stood nearby, his face a mix of sadness and resolve, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. The larger wolf let out a soft whine, a sound that seemed to echo through the stillness as if saying goodbye. Warren knelt down, his gloved hand reaching out to stroke the larger wolf's fur one last time. The wolf leaned into his touch, his body warm and solid beneath Warren's fingers, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. The smaller wolf let out a soft whine, her tail thumping against the crate, her bandaged legs stretched out awkwardly. The third wolf, the one Warren had found in the woods, lifted his head, his eyes locking with Warren's, filled with a quiet gratitude. In that moment, Warren felt a connection, a bond that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. They were no longer just wolves. They were his family, his pack. The truck's engine rumbled, breaking the silence, and Warren stood up, his breath visible in the cold air. He took one last look at the wolves, their eyes reflecting the light, their bodies strong and healthy now, ready to return to the wild. It was a bittersweet moment, a farewell to the creatures who had changed his life forever. As the truck pulled away, its headlights disappearing into the snowy twilight, Warren felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of peace. They were free now, back where they belonged, and he had done the right thing. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes your breath visible in the light. I stood at the edge of the forest, my boots sinking into the deep snow, my heart pounding in my chest. The three wolves stood a few feet away, their bodies strong and healthy now, their fur glistening in the sunlight. The smaller wolf, her leg fully healed, wagged her tail excitedly, her eyes bright with anticipation. The larger wolf stood tall and proud, his amber eyes scanning the horizon, his posture confident and assured. The third wolf, the one I'd found in the woods, lingered near the back, his gaze flicking between me and the trees as if unsure whether to stay or go. Kara stood beside me, her hand stuffed into her pockets, a small smile playing on her lips. "They're ready?" she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. "They've come so far." I nodded, though I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat was too big, the emotions too raw. I thought about the first night they had come to my cabin, desperate and afraid, and how far they had come since then. They had trusted me against all odds, and I had done everything I could to help them. But now, as I watched them pace back and forth, their tails wagging, their eyes filled with excitement, I realized that this was the moment we had been working toward. This was their chance to be free, to return to the wild where they belonged. I knelt down, my hand reaching out to stroke the larger wolf's fur one last time. He leaned into my touch, his body warm and solid beneath my fingers, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, it felt like he was saying, "Thank you, The smaller wolf nuzzled my hand, her tail wagging furiously, and the third wolf let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. I stood up, my heart aching with a bittersweet mix of joy and sadness. "Go on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're free now." The larger wolf let out a low bark, his tail wagging as he turned toward the trees. The smaller wolf followed, her movements quick and excited, and the third wolf hesitated for a moment, his eyes locking with mine. Then, with a final glance, he turned and bounded after the others, his body strong and sure. I watched as they disappeared into the trees, their forms blending into the shadows, their breaths visible in the cold air. The forest seemed to welcome them back, the trees swaying gently in the wind, the snow crunching beneath their paws. I stood there for a long time, my heart full, my eyes stinging with tears. They were free now, back where they belonged, and I knew that I had done the right thing. But as I turned to walk back to the cabin, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. They were gone, and with them, a piece of my heart. But as I looked up at the sky, the sun setting behind the trees, I felt a sense of peace. They were free, and so was I. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warm glow filling the room with a sense of peace. I sat in my chair, a mug of tea in my hands, staring into the flames. The cabin was quiet now, the silence broken only by the occasional pop of the fire and the soft rustle of the wind outside. It was strange how empty the space felt without the wolves. For weeks, they had been a constant presence, their soft whines and cautious footsteps filling the cabin with life. Now, they were gone, back in the wild where they belonged, and the silence felt almost overwhelming. But as I sat there, gazing at the photo Kara had sent me, a snapshot of the three wolves, healthy and strong, standing at the edge of the forest, I felt a sense of peace. They were free now, back where they belonged, and I knew that I had done the right thing. But it wasn't just about them, it was about me too. The wolves had come into my life at a time when I needed them most. They had reminded me what it meant to care, to fight for something, to believe in the possibility of second chances. They had shown me that even in the harshest of environments, kindness and compassion could thrive. And in doing so, they had changed me. I wasn't the same man I had been before they arrived. I was stronger, more resilient, more connected to the world around me. The wilderness no longer felt like a place of isolation and loneliness. It felt like a place of possibility, of connection, of life. I took a sip of my tea, the warmth spreading through me, and I thought about the future. The wolves were out there, somewhere in the wild, living the lives they were meant to live, and I was here in my cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready to face it. The fire crackled again, and I leaned back in my chair, my eyes closing as I let the warmth wash over me. Outside, the snow fell gently, the wind whispering through the trees. The wilderness was alive, and so was I. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone.